Hello, everyone. My name is Siobhan McMenemy, and I'm the senior editor at WLU Press. Welcome to the launch of an impressive collaboration between authors, musicians, and scholars, including many of those of you in attendance today. We're here, of course, to celebrate community music at the boundaries, the book as well as the significant messages that it conveys. As many of you know, this new book is an important record of an eventful gathering, the International Community Music Conference, which was held in 2017 at Wilfrid Laurier University's Faculty of Music, where Lee Willingham, colleagues, and community members welcomed an open, lively, wide-ranging celebration of music in its many forms and from our many and various communities. And as an aside, I have to add, it was one of the best conferences I've ever attended. The gathering was held on land that is part of the Haldeman Tract, which is itself a part of the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and is shared generously with the Laurier community in Waterloo, Ontario. Even as we meet today in this virtual space online, acknowledging our place within the communities that envelop us is as important and vital as appreciating and celebrating the music created in community. It was my pleasure to have had the opportunity to work with Lee on the publication of the book, and it's my pleasure to introduce him to you now. Lee is a professor of music education at Wilfrid Laurier University, the coordinator of the MA in the community music program here, and the director of the Laurier Center for Music in the Community. He will also be our MC for the remainder of the event. Congratulations, Lee, and to many of you as contributors to the volume on the book's publication. And now over to you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. And I want to express my thanks also to Claire and to Maya from WLU Press. WLU Press is a rather small enterprise housed in a mid-sized university, but it produces quality publications on vitally important topics. And we have been the beneficiaries of their care, their meticulous attention to details, and the integrity of their personnel. So thank you very much. I welcome everyone who has joined us today. There is a Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to put in any comments, questions, and we will address these at the end of our formal program. This volume exists in no small part to the leadership and inspiration of our former dean, Dr. Glenn Carruthers. Just hang on a second, I'm trying to get an amazing picture up here. This picture is of Roger Manti and myself with Glenn in Glasgow, Scotland. It was taken by Heather Carruthers when we just ran into each other on the street at the occasion of the ISME 2016 World Congress. Glenn's vision and his passion for new and creative pathways for music in higher education provided the oxygen for us to proceed with the conference and to respond to Siobhan's suggestion for a book possibility. Glenn was all in on this. We miss Glenn profoundly. His chapter 5 is possibly his final publication. He left us in December, but we continue to benefit from his uncanny ability to guide, to inspire, and to deliver. And I want to dedicate this book posthumously to Glenn for his inspiration and leadership. The call for chapter proposals yielded an avalanche of responses. It was overwhelming, and fortunately, there was some research funding available to hire Rebecca Mackay as an RA to handle, collate, and respond to authors. Her databases continue to help sort things out throughout this process. So Rebecca went and graduated on us and left, but not before a peer review process yielded 32 chapters as thematically and coherently suitable. There's still some arguments about that, but they're here in this volume today. The next crop of grad students arrived, and with more funds, we were able to engage Fiona Evison, Nikki Kazimzadeh, and Nathan Stretch in copy proofing and all the work that entails. They graduated and left me hanging once again. COVID came. Lots of elective processes were put on hold as we all scrambled to find ways to make our teaching and research possible. ISME 2020 came, and many of us were in leadership positions to mount and host the CMA assemblies in June and July of last summer. If you have ever been a contracted author or editor and you haven't completed the task, you will know that not a day goes by that you're not reminded that authors are waiting for you, that a publisher is committed to something that you haven't quite delivered, and maybe the task is too big and the challenge is too much for these days. I'll never forget emails I got. Hey, Lee, remember that article? Is that book still happening? What's the name of that book? I'm applying for a job and I want to cite the article I wrote, and on it went. And, you know, the publishers and all of the authors and all of the production people were so patient as we struggled through getting this off the ground. Enter Josh Manuel. Josh is the senior assistant to the Dean of Music. He agreed, again with some funding, to do a thorough final copy edit to provide design and index for all images, tables, and figures. And then what to do about a general index. This was becoming a very large book. Well, Josh said he could do it if we could hire some help for him. 2 recent grads who were good at this type of thing. And voila, we have a 33-page index. I love indexes. I hate books that don't have indexes. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. This is a really fine index. Now I have to say that Josh's DNA is literally on every one of the 632 pages of this book. So a huge thank you to all of the production, post-production, publicity, and author contributors to this volume. Very briefly, what has this process revealed to me? A couple of things. Community music is a global enterprise, but community music as a discipline can barely claim that it speaks for community music practices that engage people around the world. But it increasingly demonstrates that as it evolves in scholarly endeavors, it must always rely continuously on the grassroots practice to learn and be informed by those who are engaging in music facilitation with people. Community music is not a regulated or rule-driven body, but it does build its practice on some common foundational principles that both intentionally and implicitly drive that practice. Community music reflects the context and the culture of the community in which it exists. Community music in Canada might not resemble community music in Northern Italy or in Ireland or in Los Angeles. Finally, authors provide a deep dive into their own work where people, places, diversity, participation, inclusion, or another way of saying that is who, what, where, why, and how are explored. These are real. They are happening now or have recently happened. These are dynamic examples of where music lives outside of the center, in the margins, places where human expression is dramatically powerful, where there is access for participation, and where empathy and hospitality are engaged. So what distinguishes community music from general music education? One characteristic is that community music intentionally finds people in the margins, finds ways to engage those underserviced and unresourced. And that, my friends, is the purpose of this book. We've invited a few speakers to speak on behalf of either an aspect of the book they contributed to or a section that they wrote in. And I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker is my colleague, Lee Higgins. Welcome, Lee.
Hi, thank you. Here it is. Awesome. Great. I mean, congratulations to Lee, Wilfrid Laurier, and all the authors for this book. I also wanted to talk about the determination of Lee and Glenn Carruthers, which was so central that Lee Willingham has did a very nice introduction for Glenn. His influence on pushing these things forward at Wilfrid Laurier can't be underestimated. It's a very exciting book, and of course I'm honored to start the conversation. And why am I excited about this book? I think it boils down to a couple of things for me. So these are personal things, I think. I think one, the first thing is that it represents a growth in the discourse. The book here is got some more senior writers in it, but it's got a lot of, it's supporting new ideas and new visions from emerging scholars. And I think that's really exciting. And I'm reminded of the Oxford Handbook of Community Music that Bridie Lee Bartlett and I did, came out, say, 4 years ago. And I think we had something like 56 authors in that book. And although there's some of those authors in this book, in the Oxford Handbook, actually most of the authors are new. They're not in that book, will only come out 4 years ago. And for me, that's fabulous. It really points towards the growth in this field. And the second point I want to make, and beginning from the personal really, but also reflective of Roger Mantai's introduction, is that the book, in some ways, you know, when I engage in it, engage the ideas in it and look at the index to some extent, responds to, I think, my PhD dissertation of 15 years ago now that was titled Boundary Walkers. And that notion, the idea of the marginality and the positive aspects of marginality became a central trope in that work. And what I want to say, or move from that personal thing and talk in some broader way to all the contributors, is whilst writing that PhD at that time, I was challenged quite often by actual fairly senior community musicians about the validity of theorizing and scholarship in community music, quite aggressively sometimes. So I wanted to say to the emerging scholars and the new voices that are housed in this book, is that you need to believe in yourself and stay true to your vision, both as a practitioner and as a researcher, because even though you may feel like a small cog in a much larger discourse and a larger sort of practice, and you're trying there to make a difference, but if you keep and stay with your tenacity and your commitment, you really can make a significant impact in all different ways that you can't imagine. And I hope, and I'm sure that this book will in fact make those connections for lots of you and make those impacts. So congratulations to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee. Lee Higgins has been with our program really since the first day it started at Laurier, and we count him as a great colleague. Roger Mantai was invited to write the foreword, and another wonderful colleague and collaborator in many ways. And welcome, Roger, and thank you again for that brilliant foreword you have given us.
Well, thank you, Lee, and to Lee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I have to be honest, thinking about this book launch got me somewhat nostalgic. Thinking back, back in the PhD days, my colleague Lynn Tucker and I had attended the Adult and Community Music NAFME Special Interest Group Conference in 2007 and had published our Closing the Gap article in the then fledgling IJCM in 2008, which was volume 1, number 2. Around the same time, I remember attending a local conference where Lee Willingham unveiled Wilfrid Laurier University's Center for Music in the Community. Now, truth be told, all of us knew precious little at the time about the history of community arts and community music movements in the UK and Ireland, or the nuanced history of ISME's Community Music Activity Commission. So I can't speak for Lee Willingham, but I know that back then, Lynn and I associated the words community music with the community music movement of the American and Canadian music educators of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. All Lynn and I knew in the early 2000s was that David Elliott had gotten behind the idea of community music as founding editor of IJCM. And, you know, if David Elliott was behind it, it had to be a good thing. So go figure that Lynn and I would end up working at the same university, and our music and culture program now features community music as one of its prime academic areas of focus. I think many of you probably know this, but for those who don't, Lee Higgins and I both joined the music education department at Boston University in the fall of 2009. And I mention this little factoid not just because we happen to have provided a foreword and postscript for this volume, but because of how remarkable it is that a book like this has come to be and that we are both on this Zoom call together. So depending on how old you are, a dozen years or so isn't that long really. And yet in the context of community music, so much has changed since the early aughts. I don't have to tell anyone here today that community music has arrived. And this is not to overlook or diminish the importance of all those who have been engaged in this kind of work for literally decades, but rather it's to acknowledge the seismic shift that has occurred in the scholarship on, about, and related to community music. Lee Higgins and I have spent many an hour together over the years, be it on the squash court, pub hopping, attending concerts, walking the streets of New York or Corfu or Baku, or these days on Zoom like everybody else. While we only worked together at BU for a few short years, it really is hard to overstate the importance of those years. While some of our friendship had sort of a family aspect to it, in our capacity as professors, we would often sort of nerd out on things like teaching versus facilitation, formal versus informal, learning versus participation, Derrida versus Foucault, and perhaps most importantly, though, on how to create a theoretical and coherent basis for a field of practice without losing or negatively impacting the ethos that is that practice's lifeblood. What I remember most about those early discussions is that neither of us was interested in self-aggrandizement or empire building or in faux academic pretension, but in genuinely wanting to make a difference in the world, however you define that. Those were the discussions, incidentally, that sowed the seeds for my own book on music, leisure, and education, set to be published by Oxford later this year, cross your fingers, and yay, another online book launch to look forward to. So I know that the first thing each of you did when you received your copy of the book was to immediately read the foreword, but if you can bear hearing the words again, I'd like to read just one short paragraph for you now. I promise you, by the way, that Lee and I did not coordinate our intros for this, so just a coincidence that he happened to mention the same thing. Anyway, from the book, Walking the Boundaries is an apt homage to and perhaps reassessment of Lee Higgins's 2006 dissertation, Boundary Walkers, Contexts and Concepts of Community Music, the primary target of which was, quote, institutionalized music activity. Higgins proudly brandishes the flag of outsider, proclaiming how community music, quote, affirms and embraces the margins. One is left wondering, however, if community music now needs to think less in terms of margins and more in terms of liminality and thresholds. Having established a solid academic disciplinary base and ensconced itself in higher education, having gone from the margins to the mainstream, as it were, community music may have to reckon with no longer being the outsider looking in, but instead being something of the mestiza, not quite insider, not quite outsider. In short, a boundary walker. So I want to offer my congratulations to all the authors in this collection, which stands as an absolutely wonderful testament, not only to boundary walking, but boundary traversing and transversing, boundary making and remaking, boundary affirmation and resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And I know that everyone has read the foreword. It's one of the best things in that book. In your chat line, Maya is putting some links for you if you wanted to find ways to get the book and perhaps a little bit of a discount for your attending today. I'm really delighted to introduce Andy Mcpherson, who was the artist for the cover. And I'm just going to put the cover, the original artwork of the cover up there, and give it over to Andy to just explain what we're looking at here. Welcome, Andy Mcpherson.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'm a local retired math high school teacher, a local musician in jazz and folk music, and also an illustrator of some sort. And I was just thrilled to be asked by Lee to contribute something to his project. At the time, or for many years, I have been running a drum circle and meeting with students at school. Definitely on the margin. These were kids who couldn't read music, but wanted to be involved. Kids who maybe didn't fit in various ways, but found that by drumming together, they experienced community. And so I've been involved with that project all of my career in teaching. And that's one of the things that I miss now, actually, now that I've retired from that. So to be invited to participate by Lee was really a lovely ask. And so we met in a coffee shop. Well, I first met Lee actually at the Gahu drumming experience in downtown Kitchener. I think that might have been a project of the Laurier Community Music Program. I'm not sure, but I know some of the folks involved with that, and I know they've participated in the program. So I think it's an extension of that. Anyway, that's where I met Lee for the first time. And then the next time was in a coffee shop. So that tells you that it was pre-COVID. And during our coffee together, he was describing the context of this project, and the words that you see on this illustration came from that conversation. And I just love the idea of this boundary idea. But I thought a spiral might work nicely, because in a spiral, there's no inside and there's no outside, and it just keeps growing. And I kind of like the idea of intersections. And while we're talking about boundaries, I feel like probably most of us want to smash apart some of those boundaries. So it's good to talk about what they are and to challenge those. But certainly that's one of the reasons why this illustration ended up in a spiral. There's a quilt element to it with all the stitching, and that just places this whole project within the Waterloo region and our Mennonite, I'm not a Mennonite, but the roots of this region with the quilting and so on. So that became part of this illustration as well. And then just trying to incorporate movement and flow and so on, that was important. So that's how this illustration came about. So once again, so pleased to be asked. Very impressed with the Laurier Press. They have dealt with me as on a side level very professionally. And so I thank Claire and the Laurier Press, and I thank Lee for asking. And I wish great success to this program, and I look forward to reading sections of the book, reading all of the book. So thank you very, very much, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's a striking cover, and I keep looking at it and discovering new things. Now, the format of this webinar is such that there are many distinguished participants that we can't see or hear from, and many of whom are authors of this book. I'm going to very quickly just shout out to the names of the authors that you're not meeting on screen today. Deanna Yarachuk and Justice Krar, Lindsay Castellano, Dave Camlin, of course, we've mentioned Glenn Carruthers, Phil Mullen, Liz Parker Cook, Chrissy Alexander. We're going to meet Don Coughlin, but his co-author was Will Dabek. Annie Mitchell, Brent Rowan, Antonella Coppi and Johannes van der Sant, Gina Greer, Rich Marcella, Pete Moser, Bridie Bartlett, Kelly Lorela, Haiti Ahonen, Bev Foster, Sarah Pearson, Sasha Judelson, Mary Cohen and her colleagues, Jonathan Kana and Richard Weinmiller, and Ines Lamela, Paola Rodriguez, and Grasa Mota, Rebecca Jordan Miller, Danielle Sirek, Brandon Lease, Jane Southcott, and her partner, a co-author, Leon de Bruin, and Alicia Jo, Hisun, Kari Veblen, and Patrick Potter. These people contributed greatly to the book. There will be a separate launch for the Asian Pacific region later in May. Some of them are still in bed right now. But right now, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Kathleen Turner from the University of Limerick in Ireland, who will speak on behalf of Section 1, Walking the Boundaries of Contexts and Borders. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you, Lee, and hello, everyone. Boundaries are points that can divide, markers for where we can or cannot go, where we do or don't belong, or where we have or have not been invited. They can be lines of exploration, signs for us to stop, look in both directions, and then cross to meet each other. This section of the book, Walking the Boundaries of Contexts and Borders, is about those signs to stop, look in all directions, and to cross, to further our understanding of community music practices through constructive, compassionate critique of our tools, our approaches, our motivations, our institutions, and our language. This critical engagement is particularly important when we're discussing community music in the service of or in collaboration with communities who have been underserved, underrepresented, misrepresented, over-researched, not consulted, or ignored. We're challenged to consider our motivations for our facilitation of participatory music practices. What or who are we acting in the interests of? When we use words like inclusion or accessibility, what do we really mean? And how do we put those values to work? As Deanna Yarachuk and Justice Crowr so powerfully remind us, inclusivity is a doing word, an action. They say active and continual work where musically inclusive strategies meet socially inclusive strategies. That is a call to action and a call to reflect. This section offers questions as well as answers. Provocative questions, such as who truly owns the music making process? What are the boundaries to access? How do those boundaries change according to who or where you are? The social, cultural, political, physical, or financial. As Dave Camlin challenges us, who are the haves and the have-nots in terms of political access to means of cultural production and reproduction? Who shapes the world we live in? Who dictates what experiences we have access to? In my community, the roots of our music making were initially informed by words like at risk, disadvantaged, vulnerable. But when I asked the children I worked with how they defined us as a community, they said skilled, valued and valuable, exceeding others' expectations, and influential. The words we use to describe ourselves, our practices, and our communities matter. That's not to say that we ignore trauma, conflict, pain, or deprivation, as Lindsay Castellano so clearly articulates here. Rather, we strive to create the environment where needs are met and safety is established, creating opportunities to begin that important business of expressing ourselves, exploring our self-identity, building our confidence, and flourishing in our communities through our music making. This section offers some tools for challenging boundaries. Dave encourages us to be vigilant in critiquing our assumptions. Lindsay encourages us to be sensitive, to listen, and to observe. I invite us to consider our language and the power dynamics within it. Deanna and Justice ask us to consider what we mean when we say inclusive and what are we actually going to do about it. And finally, Glenn Carruthers challenges the bounds of our institutions to create spaces where the study of music is about the sharing of music, and in that way that is thoughtful, loving, compassionate, and understanding. So in closing, I want us to imagine that, exchanging boundaries in community music making for songlines, maps, a colourful atlas guiding us to institutions, practices, words, and tools that are thoughtful, loving, compassionate, and understanding. Sinead.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I mentioned Rebecca Mackay in my opening remarks as one of the RAs that helped us get this book going. But chapter 5, Glenn's chapter, was really transcribed from a keynote address, and Rebecca was the keynote transcriber on that. And I don't think she's given proper credit in the book. So I just wanted to shout out to Rebecca for making Glenn's speech into an academic chapter. So thank you for that. Dr. Dawn Kaufman from the University of Miami will speak to us about walking the boundaries of education, ensembles, and changing paradigms. Welcome, Dawn.
Thanks, Lee. I'm moved something here, so I need to get back into shape. There we go. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about section 2. And as Lee identified, education, ensembles, and changing paradigms. And I hope to say something useful here. This section has 10 chapters, twice the size of the other sections, and has what might seem to be a rather enigmatic heading. As I read the chapters, I looked to understand how they might cohere, how they might fit under this umbrella, and how they might be differentiated from the other sections. So here are a few recurring issues with brief shout outs to the contributors. Number 1, bridging formal and non-formal education. At least half of the chapters demonstrated how community music can be an extension of the school music program or an alternative when school music programs aren't available. Richard Marcella's account of the Regent Park School of Music gets a shout out here. Number 2, reaching out to disadvantaged or marginalized groups, which is no surprise. Again, at least half the chapters address meeting the musical, emotional, cognitive, and social needs of an array of different populations, young and old. Thank you, Phil Mullen, for giving me a new descriptive label for people, children in challenging circumstances, or CCC. And thanks to Pete Mosier for his descriptions of community music projects in the UK. Number 3, youth ensembles, specifically El Sistema programs within schools and within community-based programs. Christine DeAlexander wrote about a program in California, and Antonella Covey and Johan van der Sand described a program in Italy. Number 4, adult community ensembles. My friend Will DeBack and I wrote about the impact of New Horizons wind bands on older adults in North America, and Annie Mitchell contributed a chapter on an adult community orchestra and a chorus in Australia. Number 5, changing paradigms. Here I'm going to try and infer what Lee and other people may have intended by this label. We have Elizabeth Parker Cook's efforts to combat gender barriers in schools through musical composition with her students. Next, we have Brent Rowan's presentation of how conductors could apply mindfulness practices during the rehearsals. And finally, Gina Greer allows us to rethink music literacy in her descriptions of 2 projects using non-conventional electronic technology. So there, in a matter of seconds, you have a good section of the book covered. And I hope you have a good read. I enjoyed reading it. That's it.
That was an express trip through a big chunk. And thank you so much, Dawn, for that. Part 3 is walking the boundaries of indigeneity. And representing that section is Glenn Murray. Welcome, Glenn.
Hi, everybody. So I am grateful to be here and to be included in Lee's book. So I just wanted to reflect back on what Lee Higgins said about new authors and new community musician, community music practitioners, and share this journey. You know, when I studied at Laurier with Lee Willingham, I think he took a chance on me, and let me turn my mic volume up. Sorry, is that better? And yeah, he took a chance on me and believed in me. And then, you know, through Lee, I met Roger Manty, and so this progression forward of community music and its practices is kind of been a real focus point of my life. And I taught this winter with Roger's guidance at U of T, and used Lee Higgins' book, Community Music and Theory and Practice, in my course study, and the 2 Lees engaging in community music. And so now here at this third book, which is this beautiful progress, and to be a part of that is an affirmation that my journey is purposeful, and it's fulfilling, and that I'm on the right path. So I think the book's exploration of all the different pathways and representations of that is amazing. And now that I'm done marking, it's going to be a summer read for me. So in particular, what I was able to share with you was my master's capstone, and so the reflections of that. And I remember I reviewed my notes from my professors on that, and overwhelmingly they recommended that I speak in the storytelling sense of what happened. So that's what this chapter is, in the subtext of the search for truth and reconciliation through cultural partnership is me growing into the understanding of that, and to continue to grow into understanding about the complex relationship that we've had in the past with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and that I hope to nurture and grow and improve through my own work and my own research and my own open heart to it. So in essence, it speaks of our history, where our Indigenous people were our early settlers, guides, and keepers of the river systems that wound their way through Canada, opening their way to trade, exploration, and settlement, like the two roads wampum belt, in equal partnership and understanding. However, now I feel like that partnership is a foreign concept, and the relationships have deteriorated from cooperation and trade to colonial oppression and genocidal practices of residential schools in the 60s scoop. Our own nation's apathetic and racially inhibited response to missing and murdered indigenous women is one of the examples of the residual impact of the level of xenophobia that has existed towards our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We're settlers, all of us, and our Indigenous people were our first peoples. So I seek to honor, learn, and embrace that history. I am the son of an immigrant from a racist country. My father came here in 1964 on a boat with a suitcase and a dream, from South Africa, a racist country. And he left the oppressive apartheid system to give us a better life. And I think it is in that pioneering spirit that I seek knowledge and awareness, and use my music and art to uplift and embolden those around me to find their purpose and belief in themselves and their own culture or history. As a nation, we stand on a poor foundation, and I don't believe that we can expect to grow forth with a strong vision, purpose, and most importantly, a sense of place until we acknowledge fully that history, embrace it, display it, and grow from it. And that is my purpose in a lot of my work in my life, is to continue to stand beside my Indigenous brothers and sisters. And I view them that way because I have relationships with them that go beyond academics and my work with the nonprofit. The relationship that I enjoy with them is one of sharing our lives, sharing our art, sharing our music. And I've learned much from their giving culture, their open culture, their enlightened view towards women, and giving them historically a strong sense of place in their culture that is lacking in our own. The respect for their elders, that is also lacking in our own culture. And some of that, unfortunately, has been lost. So Truth and Reconciliation seeks to reclaim that. And this chapter, to be able to share the work that I did through my master's course, is an honor. And I hope that people can read it and be inspired to reach out, because that's what Truth and Reconciliation is, a mandated declaration for us as a nation to reach forward in partnership and stand beside our Indigenous brothers and sisters. It's not merely a document, it is a mandated declaration. And I hope that Canadians come to understand that and embrace it and engage in it in a full, open-hearted fashion. So thank you for this opportunity to speak and share with you today.
Thank you, Glenn. And not only are Canadians watching us, but the world is watching Canada as to how we respond. So I appreciate that very much. The fourth section is walking the boundaries of health and wellness. And I welcome Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell, who's part of the Laurier Faculty of Music Therapy program. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks, Lee, so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today with this really dynamic group of community musicians, music therapists and educators and activists, scholars, colleagues. And thanks, Lee, so much for the invitation to say a few words about Section 4. So as a music therapist myself, I thought it would be appropriate to speak a little bit about the concept of boundaries as that concept relates to music therapy and community music and the intersections of those fields. So community music and music therapy are in a way both boundary practices. Community musicians, as Lee already described, often exist on the boundaries of traditional music education and performance practices. And as music therapists, we often exist on the boundaries of healthcare. And as professions, we share common roots. As Gary Ansdell describes, music therapy and community music originated from a common belief in musicking as a means of working with people. So he lays it out pretty simply there. And these fields gradually carved their own paths through the latter part of the 20th century. Community music largely stayed at that grassrootsy level that we've been talking about, challenging the norms and standardization of traditional academic and education and healthcare systems. And music therapy, in contrast, sought out formalized recognition within these same systems, and so developed quite formalized standards of practice and models, which were often based in theories from medicine and psychology. And around the turn of the 21st century, a collective of music therapists began speaking out more vocally about what risks being lost when we frame music therapy only in terms of highly boundaried clinical treatment. And certainly if we look to the ways that human societies have always used music, we see this participatory and performative art form that's being celebrated here today, that's embedded in context, connected to community, and also connected to social activism. And so community music therapy was officially recognized within the music therapy community in the early 2000s, although many music therapists had been practicing this way for much longer than that. And so in this way, community music therapy kind of walks the boundaries even within formalized music therapy practice. And simultaneously, we know that community musicians are increasingly interested in the health implications of their work. And also, as the Faculty of Music at Laurier showcases, also in finding their place within academia and really formalizing that. And as Lee Higgins and Lee Willingham suggest in their previous publication, music therapists are expanding their practices to become more politically and socioculturally sensitive, while community musicians are more consciously working towards participants towards health-related outcomes. So we exist on a continuum, and continuums are really often messy and even tense places to exist, particularly when the work can overlap with each other in a society in which jobs in the arts are often scarce. But with every fiber of my being, I know that as music therapists and community musicians, there's such potential for interdisciplinary work if we're willing to sit with this tension and overlap and really explore the places of synergy and also distinction between our fields. And in these conversations, we can hold to that music that is our shared medium, a social and relational art form. And I'll go out on a limb to say it was the community musicians that had that part right all along, and really rooting their work in that. So it's an honor to share this section with such incredible authors and scholars, all boundary walkers in their own way. And something that I really love about this section is that it has examples of this continuum of work. So music therapists practicing music therapy, music therapists practicing community music, and both music therapists and community musicians practicing what we might broadly call health musicking, to use Stiga's term. My colleague, Dr. Heidi Ahonen, speaks about her music therapy practice with refugees who've experienced trauma. Bev Foster details establishing a foundation for providing musical resources and training for caregivers. And Sarah Pearson builds upon that chapter to outline her own work in developing music care training, which is dedicated to promoting a wider presence of music in healthcare. And Sasha Judelson shares how people with dementia and their caregivers and high school volunteers can find community and greater well-being through singing in a choir together. In my own chapter, I speak about a creative arts summer camp for children with disabilities, and specifically about the camp's cumulative performance and the opportunities it affords for relationship development and identity development for its participants. So I'm a music therapist, but in this chapter, I'm thinking about the ways that health and wellness and relationship are all benefits of, or potential benefits of music making that can transcend disciplinary category as a music therapist practicing as a community musician. So congratulations to all of the authors here today, and particularly to Lee Willingham. I've read many of these chapters, but not all of them yet, and I'm certainly looking forward to digging into the book myself even more. So thank you, Lee.
Thank you so much, Liz. We have some amazing colleagues at Laurier, I have to tell you. Our next section is Walking the Boundaries of Prisons, and I've invited Dr. Kirsten Anderson, who's a lecturer at the University of West Scotland, to present on behalf of that section. I have to tell you that I've only met Kirsten 2 or 3 times in person, but I feel very much a friendship with her. And I just wanted to document that when we're together in Scotland, we do research. And this is us researching some local beverages called single malt scotches, and Kirsten's on the right. That's one of my favorite pictures. Sorry for that indulging. Kirsten, welcome, and come and join us.
Hello, thank you, Lee. Haste you back to Scotland. We can't wait until the pandemic ends and we can have you back. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or depending on where you are in the world, good evening. Thank you very much, Lee, for inviting me to speak briefly about community music and the boundaries of prison. And many, many congratulations on this beautiful book. I know how many emails Lee had to deal with from myself on my own chapter, so I can only imagine the administrative load of editing such an extensive and exciting collection. So in the introduction of the book, Lee tells the story of how boundary walking, or beating the bounds, was a ceremony that enabled communities to pass down to younger generations the knowledge of where the physical boundaries of their territory or their community were laid. So boundaries by design, for better or worse, divide. Boundaries can be used to keep people on one side, to prevent the other from entering, often from seeing, to restrict, to deny, and to control. And I can think of no better concept to describe a prison. I invite you to consider the role of musicians and music in prisons. I don't have enough time this evening to share with you the incredible amount and variety of music making that takes place in carceral spaces around the world, but the section in the book will give you a flavor of that. In the book, you can read about Dr. Mary Cohen's work since 2009 on leading a choir in a prison in Iowa, alongside the personal reflections of the experiences making music in custody by Richard Weinmiller and Jonathan Cana. Dr. Anesh Lamela, along with Professor Paulo Rodriguez and Professor Graça Mota, writes extensively on the experience of teaching piano to women in a prison in Portugal. Individual lessons are rare in prisons, and Dr. Lamela even managed to negotiate individual practice time 3 to 4 times a week for each participant, each woman being given an hour by herself at the piano. Dr. Rebecca Jordan Miller writes about her experiences leading music therapy sessions in a women's federal prison in Canada, and I reflect on a series of creative conversations designed for musicians to work with health and criminal justice staff in Scotland. These are just a few examples of the music making that takes place in prisons around the world. Unlike hospitals and schools, prisons are designed to harm, and harm they do. As a former primary school music teacher and someone who has led numerous music sessions in hospitals, I acknowledge that harm and sorrow can happen in those environments as well. But the prison environment is unique. And that gives us a challenge as musicians when considering our role or multiple roles in these spaces. Some musicians will go into a prison, a musician, and leave that prison, a musician. Some musicians will go into a prison, a musician, and leave a concerned citizen. And some musicians will go into a prison, a musician, and leave an activist. But why should we all care about music making in prisons? Prisons are a part of our communities. Those of you here tonight who work in schools will have some children whose parents are in custody. Those of you who work with communities who experience homelessness or addiction may already see how these communities too often are connected to the carceral state. Those of you who work with Indigenous communities may already know about the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in your country's prison system, an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prison systems that is seen throughout the world. Prisons are a part of our communities, and the reach of prison is far. All of you here tonight will have a prison in your community. You may not know the name of it or where it is, but you will know the location and name of the closest school or hospital. It's our responsibility, perhaps, as community musicians, to ensure that we don't forget prisons as an environment where music is made, and where music is important. Walking the boundaries of a prison as a community musician requires us to not forget about prisons and to not forget the people inside of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Our final chapter is Walking the Boundaries of Cultural Identity, and my colleague, Dr. Gerard Young, has been asked to present on behalf of those authors. Welcome, Gerard.
Thank you, Lee. And thank you for all the contributors. Just such moving presentations. And thank you for everyone else who's put this marvelous event together. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is self-locate. So by way of self-locating, my name is Gerard Young. It's a strange name. I'm a Californian, San Francisco, Chinese, Jamaican, classical choral conductor, orchestra conductor, bluegrass guitarist, contemplative musician, Zen Buddhist cultural and musical knowledge keeper in the Japanese shakuhachi tradition, an immigrant to Canada, Southern Ontario, and professor and practitioner of community musics at Wilfrid Laurier University. Now, why would anyone ask me to speak about cultural or identity? And like the rest of us today, I clearly don't have just one. And although this is the final section of the book, Walking the Boundaries, Cultural Identity, it's the smallest portion of the book, but I see it as perhaps the most important section with the greatest potential for our research, our writing, and the health of our divided world and the practices of community music, both regionally and globally. It's here in the Walking the Boundaries of Cultural Identity where we finally get to tell and listen to the stories, our stories. And here we will get to know this larger community we speak of in community music, the community of diversity. In being with these authors and their research contributions, I had to ask over and over again, what is so important about cultural identity? You know, it's important to me, but why is it important to community music? Their work and the work I believe this set of chapters calls us towards helps to answer that question in many significant ways. I guess the way to sort of informally say that question is, what's the big deal with identity? And we do see this all around us in the news constantly now. But before going on, I'd like to give a deep thank you and shout out to the authors in this section, Danielle Serrett, Brandon Leese, Jane Southcott, Leon DeBruyne, Alicia Jo Hisan, Kari Veblen, and Patrick Potter. And thank you all for bringing us into the world of cultural identity with you as our guides and touching on this deep theme of identity, which is belonging. Identity and cultural identity especially figures large in our lives, like right now, Black Lives Matters, the incredible things that are happening in Asian communities of anti-Asian violence. We're surrounded by conflict, panic, violence, which we collectively try to understand through cultural lenses still filled with bias, stereotypes, and even more insidious forms of misinformation, often that come through social media. And so I had to go back to the beginning to even begin this talk. And I had to find something in cultural constructions of identity and how we now in our research world are trying to come to grips with identity And so in the Oxford book, Cultural Constructions of Identity, Meta-Ethnography and Theory, Louis Urita and George Noblet say this: identity now, as of 2020, is defined as self-concept or self-perception that is both existential and categorically both individual and socio-cultural, and that shifts and develops over time. Individually, identity is tied to a person's identifications of senses and of activity around belonging. That is, identification is therefore the work of belonging. And I'll say that again, identification is the work of belonging. Our individual identities are always changing. They're always plastic and always being negotiated with larger collective cultural identities, which are also in constant flux. As many of you have written, people in this room have written about the concept of Ubuntu, the African concept. It says, I am who I am because of who we are. And yet the very act of creating identities, as Kirsten just said, creates boundaries, often very difficult boundaries on which we as community musicians become expert walkers. Who we are is embedded less in objective facts and increasingly today in our stories. The work of these chapters and these authors, our work in CM through cultural identity is the work of belonging. It is here you will find stories of Grenadian musicians, aging Korean harmonica players, amateur conductors, how faith practices and CM practices overlap and interweave, as well as keeping and losing musical cultural practices when we as a group move from one land to another. I recommend you read this section of the book at story time, when you can take in the stories and consider this, please. We as community musicians want to listen, to hear your stories, because we all walk the boundaries of many identities. Help us to understand our world by helping us to understand yours, to understand one another, so we can see and realize how we belong to our world and how we belong to one another. And please also contribute into this area of cultural identity, because we all have them, to teach us how to walk these boundaries of belonging. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Gerard. I want to thank all of the speakers today. I want to conclude by simply saying that while this is a fairly large book, and both in breadth and depth, it doesn't cover everything. And when you want to measure the worth of a project, sometimes you look at who didn't come, who isn't here. And this volume reached out to the wider community, but it still shows us that we're fairly much a Eurocentric, predominantly white practice. There are omissions in this book. There's no section on racial justice in music. There's no theme area in gender identity and in queer communities and their place in participatory music. There's not a section on ecological justice. Authors did not, well, they touched on, but not substantially write on systemic poverty or socio-political or religious oppression. So I'm throwing down the gauntlet and saying there's another book out there for someone to pick up. And especially in these days of intensive thinking and focusing on matters of colonization and systemic racism and white privilege, I think community music has an important voice to be heard in these areas. We're at the end of our hour. There are some questions in the, or there is a question in the Q&A, and I'm going to invite my fellow speakers to come back on with cameras. And I'd love to have somebody address Dave Mansell's question around ethics and being able to maybe be a bit more spontaneous on how we can publish things that we sometimes can't wait for the bureaucracy of an ethic review. Does anybody want to talk about that question? Sure, Kathleen.
Yeah, I just had an immediate thought on it. It's an interesting question, Dave. I'm personally a big fan of ethics procedures because I do think they make us slow down and really, really consider what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're going to do it. And if we have been as ethical as we maybe think that we are, But I appreciate what you mean about sometimes the things that happen in the moment and you want to capture them. And I guess one of the things that I found really useful in terms of capturing that are arts-based methods, you know, where we can revisit moments. Just because we can't, you know, capture them in the moment as they happen doesn't mean they're gone. There are perspectives that we can go back and revisit. We can look at narrative, we can look at visual representations, we can go back in our own memories and in the memories of others. And I think there are really powerful ways that we can revisit ethically through that. So that was just my initial response to that question.
Anyone is welcome to join in, and others that are in the participant guest area can also type in an answer to the question if you have one. I think part of our nature is to be, especially creative, to be spontaneous and in the moment, and then suddenly we have to fill out forms and wait for recommendations to come back and revisions are done, and we do it again and again and again, and then pretty soon we go, why am I don't even care about this anymore. And I think that's the spirit perhaps in which the question was asked. And Kathleen, that's very wise advice to slow down and really go deep and maybe look at another methodology. Does anybody else want to speak up on that? And then we won't hang on to, we won't hold people forever here. We know you've given us an hour and that's fantastic. Any other comments on that? Oh, so on any topic, do any of my colleagues want to say anything before we bid farewell?
I just want to share gratitude for all of you. I think everything that you shared today is incredibly inspiring. And thank you, Lee, for being, I know you hate this word, but not just a mentor, but a friend to me, which is more important than you being a mentor. So thank you.
Yeah, I love the friend thing, Glenn. I'm very grateful to all of the distinguished guests that are observing today, especially thankful that Heather Carruthers could be with us. And the community of authors now, that number more than 40 in this book, have become another community, another virtual community that we share. We share a document, but we also share a practice and many aspects of a practice. And I hope we'll find ways to stay connected. I hope those of you that get a chance to read the book or portions of it will find it challenging, evocative, provocative, and also perhaps affirming in what it is you're doing. I deeply appreciate, again, the work of Claire and Siobhan and Maya today managing us online. And I ask you all to go well and go peacefully and stay tuned for more exciting things. So farewell, everybody.